Hello, and from one point in the program to another, I hope everyone is feeling prepared for continuing straight away. We have a very packed program for you here today. Welcome to this section of the program. We will focus here on secure connectivity and critical infrastructure. I am Dan Sjöblom. I am the Director General of PTS Sweden, and I'm this year also Vice Chair of BEREC with special responsibility for, amongst other things, external relation issues. And I will be the moderator in this session that we're opening here now. In 20 minutes or so, we will have a panel discussion with a great set of people with various responsibilities in our ecosystem, and they will share their views on secure connectivity and critical infrastructure. But before we start with that, we will have a conversation with Mr. Tareq Amin, who is the Group Executive Vice President and Chief Technical Officer from Rakuten, which is, as I'm sure you all know, a Japanese company that has a wide range portfolio with products and services. And the discussion will focus on the topical issue of Open RAN. We are indeed very grateful that Tareq has agreed to join us. I believe this is a very late hour being live from Japan. How are you doing, Tareq? Is it midnight?
No, fantastic. It's still early for us in Japan. We're at about 6 o'clock here.
Okay, so it's not too bad.
No, not at all. Thank you very much.
So, are you ready to go with the questions that we have lined up for you on?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I would like you maybe to start painting us a little bit of a picture. What is Open RAN evolution? What does it look like in the short to medium term? What will it enable for us? And maybe can you even give us a glimpse of your visions from not only 5G, but maybe even into 6G?
Absolutely. So let me start a little bit, maybe just give you a brief context about Rakuten journey as we embraced a new platform architecture to connectivity. I joined in 2018 Rakuten with an ambition and dream to try to build a disruptive platform architecture built on the merit of security, diverse supply chain, hardware disaggregation, and embracing cloud in the essence of what we do to drive agility, lower infrastructure costs, and drive better services and affordability to our consumers in Japan. And one of the key tenets to enable this was, of course, Open RAN. And Open RAN, as I'm sure most of you have come to read about and understand, have become a very interesting debate item in the industry. And why it really gathered this attention, it is no doubt that telecom operators across the world today spend north of 70% of their capital expenditure on radio access. And to understand the reasons and motivation to why we needed to evolve, one must appreciate the past, how networks were deployed. And networks were always deployed based in vertically integrated stack, integrated hardware with proprietary hardware with software. The essence of cloud really never existed in the DNA of traditional telecom infrastructure. And with Open RAN, the idea came about where we wanted to disaggregate and have full control on the interfaces, full control on vendor interoperability. And the goal and objective, of course, was to lower cost and economics and burden of deploying infrastructure. And the second thing is, really is an aspiration goal, is to move from a network that always requires hardware upgrades to a network that is always evolving through software upgrades. The analogy I would give you is equivalent to what you've seen in the IT industry with the adoption of cloud. It drove amazing agility, amazing innovation, and we wanted to do the same thing with Open RAN and the adoption of Open RAN. So the first thing that we have done is complete disaggregation of the radio, adoption of baseband deployed as software on our edge data centers, and a massive automation that enabled elasticity, productivity, and efficiency into our architecture, that we have deployed in Japan. And maybe lastly, I will tell you, of course, when we started this, this was really a dream. I mean, it wasn't really simple for us to go and enable this idea of this massive hardware disaggregation, cloud enablement in every function in the network, but it required a substantial investment on our side to create a willing ecosystem of partners that believe on pushing the vision and strategy for the better good of the industry and better good for consumer, and I think better good for society and enablement of digitization. So this was really our initial approach in Japan. And of course, I will tell you today, with over 20,000 eNodeB, both 4G and 5G, fully compliant to O-RAN standards, fully deployed in Japan, we have validated and proven that this model is valid. This model is scalable. It delivers on cost and economics. And we believe that this is we're just in the early days of scratching the surface of what is possible on infrastructure modernization and infrastructure cost reduction through automation and cloudification in every function in the network in Japan.
Fantastic. You didn't mention the term 6G, but maybe we'll come to that later.
Let me, if you don't mind, let me just take one minute here just to talk a little bit about the Gs in general.
Yeah.
Because it's a really important thing. I mean, I've been in this industry for such a long time, and if I recall, maybe the first 30 years of my life, as we went from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G, the process of network modernization always had a function of hardware replacement. We change one hardware to a new hardware, and that's where we see the complexity and the cost infrastructure and the affordability factor becomes always a concern. So for us, whether we want to call it today a 5G network or tomorrow's 6G, the first thing that we needed to focus on, I believe, before we get completely excited about a terabyte wireless infrastructure network, we thought we want to fix the foundation, and foundation is a day in which network upgrades is done through software and not done through expensive hardware upgrades. So, our view is we are more than engaged and more than delighted about the potential of what a terabit wireless network is going to offer to both enterprises and consumers. But the first thing I think we owe everybody is a massive transformation on the foundation of how you build, engineer, architect the telecom networks of the future.
Great, thanks, Tareq. So let's turn a little bit to engagement with regulators. I understand that you have been in contact with quite a number of regulators, and we'll hear a little bit later in the panel from Ofcom on maybe some of their aspects on this. But maybe if you tell us a little bit what, from your perspective, what do regulators need to think of in terms of enablers and supervision of these new kinds of network? How does it change the game for a regulator? And what has been the reaction up to date when you have met with regulators and explained and discussed Open RAN issues?
Yeah, indeed, I really had the privilege and opportunity to meet with regulator in the region that we're in Asia and Asia Pacific, and regulators in United States as well as in UK and Europe. And the discussion point started by most of the regulators are intrigued, and they wanted to understand more, and they wanted to understand the use cases of Open RAN to their geographies, to their existing mobile operators, and the benefit it could bring to the larger areas. So I'm going to give you the my discussion maybe with the regulators in Japan, because obviously they've been extremely supportive, and my early days of discussion really revolved around technology exchange and technology education to ensure that we explain the merits of a cloud-native Open RAN platform networks. Our regulators were very concerned initially about stability and quality, and rightfully so, because we needed to ensure that when we build mission-critical platforms such as telecommunication network, they need to work 24/7. Service interruption is not acceptable, and we needed to prove to the regulator the merits of such a technology. We needed to prove the resiliency, the healing functions that we have implemented to deliver on what we call carrier-grade telecom network. So those discussions in Japan were met enthusiastically by the regulators, and they wanted to really engage and embrace a discussion in which they encouraged a future blueprint where we believe that this is where the future blueprint of telecom networks need to be. Now, when you look at regulators also globally, I would tell you their objectives is also the same. Most regulators, I believe, had a common objective is to drive competition, to drive efficiency in offering to end consumers, and to make sure that digitization across society is enriched by new technology like 5G, but digitization cannot be just limited to only urban and dense urban area. We have to find a way to expand this to suburban and rural areas. And this is where Open RAN technology and open cloud native architecture enable a much lower cost point for telco operators to embrace, adopt, and obviously spread and widen the coverage footprint, increase digitization. So I think this has been met with so far I really will tell you that we have received extremely positive reaction from all the regulators that we talk to. I think now the discussion point needs to revolve around the enablement and in a way, I would say maybe a slight rewarding system to reward innovation and advancements in technology that would enable operators to deploy this not only in the urban centers of their network, but to diversify this in the rural areas and suburban areas to accelerate 5G rollout, or even in the future 6G across their markets.
Thanks, Tareq. I'll get back to the topic of innovation in a moment. I just wanted to raise one more point from a regulator perspective, see if you have any views on how the topic of Open RAN would impact the traditional means of allocating or selling spectrum. Is there a relationship or an impact?
Yeah, this is, I would tell you, this is such an interesting point and a point that is, worth the debate. Obviously, I personally have worked in United States, I worked in India, and I worked in Japan and observed different characteristics to how spectrum either auctioned or allocated. So most countries, including the US, in which there are spectrum auctions that happen, that operators compete and spend a considerable amount of money to acquire spectrum. And in Japan, it is quite the opposite, that the spectrum has been allocated. If you ask me personally, I think what I have observed in Japan is really a fantastic system. It's a system that is built on ensuring massive digitization and massive acceleration of enablement of modernization of infrastructure. So spectrum has allocated in Japan, and I think with Open RAN, the regulators have now to look at interesting viewpoints. The merit of spectrum sharing and the merit of spectrum allocation versus spectrum auctions. I personally think that there is really a valuable merit to what I have seen in Japan compared to other markets. And the evidence of this is a really amazing infrastructure that exists in this country. And, it's helping all of us, including Rakuten itself and the operators in Japan, to allocate and spend capital to accelerate the build out in 5G, to commit to building 5G not only in urban areas, but to reach rural areas. So I think with Open RAN, and most importantly, open architecture with cloud native networks, now regulators have to think about, the mixed use spectrum use cases. One is the shared spectrum access philosophy, unlicensed spectrum, and I think all of them will have a role to play in the future technology architecture once Open RAN gets materialized in a much larger scale than what it is today.
Great. So let's get back to innovation. So there is, I think, a bit of an ongoing discussion about the impact of Open RAN on innovation. And some may say it will stifle innovation, less incentives to innovate into something which is non-proprietary. And others will say it will enhance innovation because it will open up opportunities for newcomers and so on. What is your view on innovation, and how can we as a society be convinced that this shift is positive?
Yeah, I'm of the opinion, my opinion is quite the contrary. I think Open RAN and cloud architecture is going to drive a massive transformation in telecom infrastructure. The analogy I advise everybody to think about, what would have happened had we not had cloud platform serving IT industries? Think about all the platforms that we all enjoy today, including the streaming service that we are talking through today, the massive OTT applications that we cannot really function without today. That was all driven by adoption of cloud and adoption of distributed compute architecture. Now, Open RAN requires a cloud native thinking in its DNA. So let me give you a specific example of Rakuten and its story in the early days, because it might be helpful for everybody to understand what we have done to enable disruption and innovation. But that was not at the cost of disrupting also the business model of larger established equipment vendors. In the early days of Rakuten Mobile, I spent enormous time working with Nokia, with its board, with its leadership, convincing them that there is a business model in which Nokia would sell Rakuten the remote radio head, and Rakuten would enable the software through one of our subsidiary company, LTO Star. This relationship requires unbelievable engagement with Nokia. And to be honest with you, our approach is we wanted to prove to Nokia that there is a viable business model. And I give Nokia lots of credit. I mean, they've taken a courageous step to move into this undiscovered territory, to discover new business model. We have innovated at every facet in this network. We have innovated on disaggregation of radio and hardware. We have innovated on massive edge compute platform deployment. We have innovated on massive automation to enable zero-touch provisioning, enable lower cost of infrastructure, to enable lower cost of services to the consumer. And all of this happened by creating an ecosystem of willing partners, including, I would say, including Nokia was involved into this process and still a critical partner to Rakuten today. So I think Open RAN and cloud native networks are exactly what telecom networks need to innovate. Innovation through proprietary hardware, in our view, is thing of the past. People that believe in cloud, people that believe in software, people that believe in AI, machine learning, would believe that the future DNA of networks are networks that are built in the concepts of full autonomy, enablement of level 4 autonomous network. That could only be enabled by architecture transformation. And we are, really a big believer, of course, in this new architecture, but we also believe that, existing large equipment manufacturers have an amazing role to play, an amazing contribution to do for the larger ecosystem. And I'm glad to show everybody the participation of large European vendors in Rakuten, how they helped and continue to help while still making a considerable amount of revenue, of course, for their shareholder and for their corporation. So we think it's an amazing opportunity to continue this innovation cycle.
Thank you. And I'll now come to my last question here, and it's about the topic of the day. So the security and resilience. I mean, what are the practical results of Open RAN seen from your perspective on those important topics?
So I think security is critical, by the way, and you know, for us, when we think about security, you know, the first thing that came to my mind, I don't think of security as only in software architecture security. This is a very broad topic that required us to rethink the entire apparatus of what our zero trust network architecture that we wanted to do in place. And the first thing that we wanted to push is security around supply chain. So maybe one question that I would ask a lot of people is, do most telecom operators know where the parts inside their platform comes from, where they're engineered, where they're manufactured, and what is the source of supply chain across the entire ecosystem? So the approach that we have taken, by the way, not just on radio, I'm talking about radio, core, transport, OSS, BSS, the first thing that we needed to ensure is 100% visibility. Remove all the black boxes from this network architecture, and then start engaging about understanding supply chain engineering, component manufacturing, the source of the factories, where they come from, and then apply the the right software architecture, whether it is around secure certificate architecture, identity management, all the premise architecture that we needed to put in place. So what I tell everybody, the first thing about securing anything you own is about visibility. And with open platform, open network architecture, the journey starts with visibility first. And then we wanted to even drive this further, and we wanted to own the entire supply chain discussion, including understanding the components, who they're manufacturing, where they come from. And I think this is really, a never-ending journey to ensure that security should be on top of mind. And security, to me, is a massive responsibility of my job. And we obviously take this very seriously, that we need to stay ahead of the game and ensure that this product is secure, is hardened, and all the right visibility across the board, end to end, is provided to us to ensure that nothing is going to come to intrude with our operation, and nothing is going to impact any sensitive data that we store on our platform and our network, and no malicious hardware will be deployed and commissioned in our infrastructure.
Thank you, Tareq. This has been great. I think we could have continued this for quite a bit longer, but our program is filled with interesting things. So I'll say thank you very much for joining us at this late hour in Tokyo. And until next time.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Take care. Bye. So we will now move into the panel part of the program. You have seen that the panelists have been asked to share their perspectives on topics such as the link between resiliency and the vibrant and diverse market. What can regulation do? Supply chain risk mitigation is something many of us are thinking about, and how to achieve the best out of flexibility, interoperability of components, and a high level of security. We will have, I hope, some diverse views. We have 5 panelists. They will all introduce themselves for roughly 5 minutes. And I will just introduce all of them now, and then we can pass the word quicker between the different interventions. So first out will be Julie Ruff, who is the head of sector for secure value chain at DG Connect at the European Commission. She will be followed by Yih-Choung Teh, who is a Group Director for Strategy and Research at Ofcom in the UK. Then we will have Lorelien Hoet, who is a Government Affairs Director for the EU at Microsoft Corporation. Florian Damas, he is a Head of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Nokia Bell. And finally, we have Jimmy Ahlstrand, who is the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer for Telenor here in Sweden. So first out is Julie. Please, you have the floor now for approximately 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dan. I hope you can hear me well. Good morning, everybody. So I'll have the pleasure to start the panel, and maybe I say a couple of words about the big picture first, which is probably all well known to you, but I think it's worth underlining first that 5G rollout is a major priority for the EU. You're all familiar with the new targets we have announced in the digital decade, so full coverage of populated areas by 2030. So very ambitious, and for that there's a lot of efforts invested in setting the right regulatory instruments around it, policy tools with the implementation of the code, with the connectivity toolbox. And also in terms of funding, there's 20% earmarked for digital under the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So that's going to be a lot of funding available for digital projects, and connectivity is one component also there. I'm going to move now directly to the security aspects, and also, of course, touch upon Open RAN in this context. As I said, timely and fast deployment of 5G is number one priority for us, and the objective is, of course, to make sure that this is done in a secure way. I think everybody acknowledges that. We heard from a previous speaker importance that they also give to security, and we're reminded of that every day. Looking at the news for 5G networks, it's really paramount. It is going to be a strong basis for mission critical services, and we also want to ensure uptake and consumer trust. So for all these reasons, there's a lot of work that's been invested already at EU level into strengthening the security of 5G networks. Concretely, what have we done and what is going to happen in this area? First of all, you may know, of course, about the process over the past 2 years that led to an agreement among member states about a common approach through the 5G cybersecurity toolbox. This was based on a very thorough risk assessment, something really unprecedented, where member states collectively work together to identify the right measures. And now we're in the phase where member states are putting in those measures in place in their countries. And we also see that they remain very committed, and we're continuing to work together with them at EU level to exchange information, to encourage as much convergence as possible between the approaches. We're also taking steps at EU level to support this, such as the launch of a request to prepare a certification scheme in the area of 5G. That's something that should help address some technical risks, and should come as a complement to other measures that need to be taken in this regard. I will also mention that now, looking forward, 5G remains a very important element of our cybersecurity strategy. So the toolbox is not the end of this process. The new EU cybersecurity strategy that was published at the end of last year announces some further steps that will be taken, and identifies objectives for the future, including some strategic objectives. I will come to that in a second. But I also want to mention the revised proposal on the NIS directive, which aims at including the telecom sector also under the same umbrella as other critical infrastructures, which we think will be a valuable step. And in all this context, supply chain security is taking greater prominence. So there's a lot of emphasis put on supply chain security and resilience in the work of on 5G cybersecurity, but also in the NIS directive. There are new provisions about supply chain security requirements, about the possibility to conduct joint risk assessments among national authorities to look at critical supply chains. And this is because, first of all, it's a major vector of threats. And it's also very important from the perspective of EU strategic autonomy. It has an important place in our industrial strategy also, we've identified in the past months through this crisis quite painfully that vulnerabilities in supply chain autonomy can have very negative consequences. And now, just as a last point, to come to and link to the discussion before on Open RAN, very clearly, we're looking with great interest into these evolutions, and Commission is really already investing and supporting software-based networks and projects in this area. And I think nobody's disputing that it's going to bring a lot of interesting potential opportunities. So we're following this very closely. At the same time, I think at this point, the pitch on the benefits and opportunities is starting to be well known, and at the same time, we feel that there's a need to analyze thoroughly a couple of aspects. So I will name them quickly. Of course, the maturity of the technology. How does this link with our deployment targets? I mean, we would like to avoid a situation where operators would want to defer the rollout of 5G networks to wait for certain technologies to be fully mature. Then there's a cost-benefit dimension that also maybe warrants a bit further assessment. Integration challenges, energy efficiency, EU capacities, etc. So these are all aspects that we're now want to look seriously into. And last but not least, of course, security. So we really want to be in a position to have a full picture of security implications, both from both regarding the opportunities and the potential risks that could arise from the new threat surface, from integration challenges, from complexity, etc. So both the benefits and potential challenges. And member states have come to the conclusion that the 5G toolbox offers an appropriate framework to conduct this analysis, building on the experience and expertise in this area. I stop here. Sorry, I might have been a bit too long.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Julie. Very dense and compact presentation of so many things that are going on. And we'll get back a little bit to that particular fact that so many things are going on. But right now, I'm handing the floor over to Yih-Choung for his introductory presentation.
Good morning. I feel privileged to join this discussion with brilliant experts from around the world. So my thanks to the IIC and BEREC. I wanted to start by reflecting on why innovation in network technology and services is so valuable to people and businesses. New and emerging technologies of just a few years ago are now widespread and have transformed our lives. For example, as we were hearing, cloud computing has not only brought cost savings and efficiencies, but it enables us to access our documents, our photos, our music, wherever we are, and on whatever device we choose. Over-the-top communications have revolutionized the way we communicate globally, with smartphones now our most favored device. And of course, video conferencing platforms have been crucial throughout this pandemic, without which we probably wouldn't be having this panel session today. Ofcom has duties to further the interests of citizens and consumers, and encouraging investment and innovation is vital to making that happen. As part of this, we are committed to ensuring we have a healthy, competitive telecom supply chain that supports innovative new services while ensuring high levels of security. Operators in the UK and globally are going through major architectural changes in their networks, as Tareq was saying. This coincides with the development of 5G, but it affects all generations of their tech. Examples, as we've heard, include virtualization, where network functions traditionally implemented in an identifiable box are now brought forward in a software module with no fixed location, as well as edge computing, where functions are brought closer to users, in some cases even on cell sites and mobile networks. Reduced costs, greater flexibility of new services, and increased choice of vendors are all reasons for this technological shift. However, the implementation and management of these changes is very different from traditional operations. That challenges operators' skills and the relationships they have with their partners. Alongside these architectural changes, concerns over the lack of diversity in the telecoms vendor market have come to the forefront due to the phasing out of so-called high-risk vendors across many countries, including in the UK. As a result, there's a desire for operators to broaden out their vendor base, and I suspect they have good commercial incentives to do so as well. No one wants to be beholden to a single vendor, but the choice of alternatives is limited at the moment. At Ofcom, we're focused on ensuring we understand emerging technologies and support the wide range of vendors and parties, working with the UK government and others internationally to achieve a more diversified telecom supply chain. In the last year, the UK has been leading important work in this area. The UK government formed an independent task force to advise on interventions for diversification and published its 5G supply chain diversification strategy, backed by an initial £250 million budget. The strategy focuses on three main pillars. One, supporting incumbent vendors. Two, attracting new suppliers for the UK market. And three, promoting the adoption of open interoperable solutions. Open RAN fits within the third pillar, which, as Tareq said, enables the disaggregation of the radio access network or RAN functionality with open interfaces, and that should help new vendors to enter the supply market. Ofcom is at the center of this innovative work. Next month, we will launch the Smart RAN Open Network Interoperability Center, or SONIC Labs for short. This is a joint program with technology body Digital Catapult, backed by the UK government, to create a platform for new and existing suppliers to test and demonstrate interoperability and integration of open and software-centric networking solutions, starting with Open RAN. We will use the SONIC Labs testbed to evaluate directly the readiness of standards for interoperability and integration. Now, the barriers of entry for a startup in the mobile industry can be very high, so we want SONIC Labs to enable and encourage new vendors from the UK and abroad to be part of the UK ecosystem. Finally, we want to build a testing ground for longer-term technology, and Open RAN is a step along the way. For example, we highlighted some of these long-term technologies in our flagship Technology Futures report published in January, covering not just mobile and wireless, but fixed and optical and emerging immersive communications services. Tackling the lack of diversity in telecom supply chains is a global challenge. But at Ofcom, we are playing our part in supporting industry to overcome some of those barriers, and supporting innovation is key to this. And we will use the expertise we gather from the SONIC Labs testbed to enable, stimulate, and promote innovation. But we will only succeed in tackling this global challenge by sharing what we learn and partnering with you and others internationally. Thank you very much.
To hearing a bit more once that SONIC Lab is up and running. It's an interesting approach to some of the issues that we all are facing indeed in terms of getting a good market out there. So without more ado, you will come back later on in the panel discussion. I'll pass the floor over to Lorelien for her introductory remarks.
Hello, thank you also to the organizers and thank you to all the panelists for the great contributions so far. I would like to spend a few minutes on thinking about the regulatory framework for resilience and cybersecurity of critical infrastructure and telecommunications in particular, and 5G, of course. And I would like to start with what Julie already mentioned, that is that the draft Commission proposal for the NIS2 extends the scope of the existing director, includes the telecommunications services, and proposes actually to exhaustively regulate the telecommunication security under NIS and to repeal the corresponding provisions from the EECC. I've seen that BEREC questions this approach, and sorry, there is a lorry working just here. See that BEREC questions this approach, but I would like to answer this. But before doing that, I think it's important to look at the questions a bit more holistically, because the NIS2 proposal interrelates not only with EECC, it interrelates also with other sector-specific regulations. Like in the financial sector, we have DORA. We also have discussions on energy-specific regulations, maybe health-specific regulations. So we need to look at the full picture. Also, the NIS2 proposal interrelates with the proposal for CER directive, which is the Critical Entities Resilience Directive. And it's important in order to have, when looking at all those pieces of the puzzle, that the resilience framework is put together in a logically and well-structured way, we believe, in order to keep the consistency and the legal certainty. And practically and concretely, we think it is logical, very logical, as the NIS proposal has done, to start with the horizontal approach, looking at the resilience requirements across sectors and to set the foundational layer, and then to see sector-specific whether additional requirements are needed. And therefore, we think that the NIS proposal makes very much sense. Another reason why we think the NIS proposal makes sense is that the EECC has been expanded in scope recently and does not only encompass traditional, usually network-based services, but also cloud-based services like OTT. And obviously, with NIS covering cloud computing, it makes perfect sense also to cover these, so to say, new telecom services together with the NIS, again, in order to achieve consistency. Another point I would like to pay attention to is the geographical scope of resilience regulation. We see that digital services are increasingly being offered cross-border. Cloud computing, that's clearly the case, but it also is the case for many IoT services or other innovative telecommunication services. And we also see that cyber attacks are cross-border. They don't stop at borders. Clearly not. There is a general acknowledgement of that, and also a general acknowledgement that it is important to work together. Yet, we also see that there is a national interest to control also cybersecurity questions at national level. And that becomes very apparent if you look at the implementation of the EU cybersecurity toolbox, where you see a myriad of different solutions of how this is being implemented nationally. Of course, national interests are key, and it's logical that nation states want us to take care of their cybersecurity at national level, but we plead also for a greater need for harmonization and coordination and alignment in order, again, to keep the resilience framework consistent. Maybe a last word that I would like to say is on the topic of cybersecurity certification, which has been mentioned by Julie already. Indeed, because we think that in this complex environment of resilience regulation, but also complex digital environment, cybersecurity certification could probably be a very useful tool let's say, to determine the foundations of resilience requirements in a harmonized way. The cloud scheme is already ongoing, and Julie has mentioned that the 5G cybersecurity scheme is being prepared. And it has been, I mean, it's clear from the previous intervention that 5G and 6G will become more complex, Open RAN, more diverse, so to say, Open RAN, cloud computing, but also at the retail side, we will see more private networks, we believe, and specific tailor-made B2B solutions. And if you then start looking at 5G cybersecurity certification, we think it's important that the new kids on the block, Open RAN, but also CSPs, private networks are consulted, and that these elements can be taken into account in the new cybersecurity certification scheme.
Thank you very much, Lorelien. Another reminder that we are looking at a more complex and diverse, as you put it, environment moving forward, and we need to be prepared, and we need to have allocate the resources necessary to be able to manage that jointly. That's an excellent introduction. I'll pass the floor on to Florian for his introductory remarks.
Good morning, Dan. Good morning, the panelists and the attendees, and thank you for the invitation from IIC and BEREC. Just first, as an introduction, I just want to remind that the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated the digital transformation, which actually has become a solution to many of the challenges created by lockdowns and physical distancing. The impact will resonate for years to come in the transformation of business, healthcare, and education, creating a digitally literate society in which technology has the potential to support democracy and restore public trust. The digital transformation of government and business plays a central role in Europe's post-COVID recovery, and digitization is key to empower innovation and entrepreneurship, bolster the EU's competitiveness and economic resilience, enable the green transition, and strengthen European values and prospects for European citizens. And telecom technologies like 5G, fiber, artificial intelligence, cloud are especially critical as they are the essential enablers of the digital transformation. 5G is transforming our societies and economies and is boosting the fourth industrial revolution. And 5G connectivity is one of the central building blocks in the interplay of sensors and data analytics tools, machine learning, artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, automation, and all will profoundly impact all sectors of the economy. So what is the role of 5G and RAN and network virtualization in post-COVID recovery? First, as 5G deployments advance and we prepare to move towards 5G standalone deployments and the industrial Internet of Things, service providers and governments have begun to take a closer look at the potential benefits of having an expanded ecosystem of mobile access players in the market. So the future of Open RAN has become a central topic of discussion and of strategic importance. While today the radio access network equipment of one vendor is typically interoperable with the core equipment of another vendor, the different modules or units within a given radio access network architecture have to be provided by a single vendor. The concept of Open RAN consists in opening the protocols and interfaces between these various building blocks or network components, radios, hardware, software, in the radio access network. And by disaggregating the RAN components and leveraging open interfaces, Open RAN will allow for a multitude of different vendor products to be used in one and the same radio access network. This may stimulate new entrants and business models, as Rakuten highlighted, and expand the current competitive setup to a multi-vendor marketplace. Open RAN is independent from the common cellular innovation cycles with current first visions formulated in 6G, but rather a potential evolution of the setup of the 5G network architecture. So what is Nokia's view on Open RAN? We strongly believe that industry stakeholders must work together to create a path for adoption of Open RAN. This must be done in collaboration with communication service providers and trusted vendors, each contributing to the standard definitions, including Open RAN interfaces, and defining a technology-driven plan for adoption. Nokia has provided an initial set of Open RAN functionalities in 2020, whereas a more complete suite of Open RAN defined interfaces built on top of Nokia's existing AirScale software is expected to be available in 2021, this year. We are ready to engage with partners and governments to advise on how to set up conducive public funding programs and to participate in concrete lighthouse projects to develop, trial, and deploy Open RAN-based connectivity solutions. In this way, we can expect initial deployments in Europe in the near future, with Open RAN-enabled deployments predicted to gradually overtake traditional RAN deployments over the coming years. And Nokia is committed to delivering on the 5G transformation, and we believe that a well-coordinated effort around open solutions will contribute to the success of this journey. So that will be my introduction.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Florian. And we'll get back to you very shortly when we get the panel started. So last out in the among the speakers for the introductory part here is Jimmy. You have the floor for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for having me in the panel. I'm here to represent Telenor, and we are perhaps not known to everyone, but we have a solid 160 years of experience in providing communication networks, and we have 187 million subscribers across Northern Europe and Asia. And my perspective in this panel will be the operator's perspective, and from that perspective, I would like to raise three major points. First, when it comes to security regulation, we see a need for predictable regulation and a long-term perspective. We operators are to invest billions in our networks, and the 5G network that we build right now should work for a decade or more. And that network will be the digital grid that European competitiveness is built on. To be able to do those investments, we need stable regulation, secure regulation for certain, but stable regulation. Otherwise, we will see less investments, less broadband coverage, less innovation, and less growth for Europe. And currently, the new regulations are coming in with such a speed that the authorities literally doesn't even have time to implement it before there is a new proposal. We should have strong regulation in this area, but when we have worked it through, as we did with the IIC, we should stick to it and allow it to exist for some time. And therefore, we believe that when it comes to NIS 2, and this might be a counter-argument to Lorelien, we believe that we should continue to have the telecom-specific regulation in the code instead. So predictable regulation would be my first point. Secondly, I'd like to stress the importance of having equal security regulation for all competitors in a field, not to distort the markets. This is important, not the least from a security perspective, a competitive perspective, of course, but also a security perspective. To give one illustrative example, in Sweden we have stronger security regulation for mobile operators than for fixed operators. And this means that fixed providers, all things being equal, can undercut mobile operators on price, driving consumers to less secure solutions. So therefore, regulation needs to be coherent across the between the different market actors, but also across the value chain. And not all responsible for telco security should therefore be put on the operators. Providers of different key technologies and services, vendors in different fields are best placed to identify and solve the vulnerabilities in their own products and services before they are spread across the whole supply chain. So we think that regulation should be broad in that respect and cover all parts of the value chain. Third and last, I'd like to stress the importance of working together, both within the countries, between authorities and market actors, but also between the countries. Security is something that we build together, not on our own. And that is not the least true for Europe with its many countries. What we see today is an increased fragmentation of the regulatory landscape based on partly security arguments, and we see this development as a risk, not the least from a security perspective. We do not need perfect harmonization, but some harmonization, and not the least operators need to be able to work cross-border to set up the strongest responses we can towards different cybersecurity threats. And that, in that context, nationalistic regulation and strong demands for national autonomy, for example, can hamper those cross-border security solutions. And therefore, we want to see increased opportunities for building cybersecurity across borders. I think I can stop there and hand back to you, Don. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. I like the part about cooperation, and we're, I think, in the perfect setting here with a wide national coverage of the program that we're having. So with those 5 introductory statements there, we are now about to move on to the question and answer session, part of the session. And I should just mention that I believe that you out there in the audience, if you have burning issues you want to raise with the panel, there is a means for you to submit questions, and there is a system for us to get those questions into the platform that we are using for the panel. So I just wanted to say that, and then I think the first question to my 5 panelists would be perhaps if anyone, having listened to the other panelists, have any immediate reactions or comments that you want to make at this stage. So the question is for anyone who wants to grab the floor and say something about what you've heard from your co-panelists.
Sure, if I may start, and I didn't comment on Open RAN, which is of course critical, and many of my fellow panelists talked about Open RAN, and we heard about Rakuten, and vendor diversity is really critical for us as an operator, and we at Telenor have a multi-vendor approach. For us, Open RAN is a very welcome initiative, and we support it fully. However, it also has to be noted, as was made by some of the speakers before, that it is a technology that is not fully developed yet. And when we build regulation, we must build it on facts and not assumption, which means that we think that it is right by the governments and others to support the initiatives. But before we build regulation, we must see that it really works.
Okay, so that's Open RAN. We will be discussing Open RAN a little bit later here. Anyone else who had any comments on co-panelists? I think the pictures are very small, so just...
I'm happy to come in.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. I'm just going to comment on Jimmy's introduction, actually, where I think the 3 points and principles he set out are very hard to disagree with. I very much agree with those points. As a regulator, we completely get that predictable regulation is really important. Indeed, in a different area, on the fixed regulatory side, we have just finished our market review of access networks and essentially put in place a framework to try and encourage full fiber deployment, thinking about a 10-year horizon to try and provide certainty for investors. On equal regulation across the value chain, again, I agree. And one of the challenges is as we move increasingly into a software-dominated world, I think that is a real challenge for regulators to understand how the different parts of that value chain are going to move and to ensure that there is a level playing field. And then, of course, on working together, I share those comments that as an independent regulator in a global marketplace, particularly when it comes to mobile vendors and issues of Open RAN, we need to work collectively together. In the UK, we represent maybe about 2% of total vendor revenues, so we're not going to get very far by ourselves. And so partnering with other regulators, governments, operators, vendors is absolutely critical for us to be able to move forward.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else in those tiny pictures. Oh, Florian, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to make 2 comments because we're talking about ways for new entrants to run their software on commercial off-the-shelf cloud computing platforms. The reason why also established vendors have custom-made system on the chip hardware solutions is to ensure that we meet the targets when it comes to energy efficiency. So we have to be very careful between everything on common platforms and also the objective of the Green Deal to reduce energy consumption. So that's my first comment. The second comment, as some of the panelists have said, since Open RAN is a natural technology evolution, respective deployment should be market-driven and not mandated. Its introduction will take place gradually as the Open RAN technology matures, and it should be left to the telecom operators' choice of how to design their respective network architecture. Now, the regulatory environment should rather encourage and incentivize the development and voluntary adoption of open solutions, while taking Europe's strategic consideration of maintaining tech sovereignty in cellular connectivity into account.
Okay, perfect. So let's move a little bit deeper, perhaps, into Open RAN opportunities and challenges. We've heard many things, starting with the presentation from Rakuten and the discussion there. And many of you mentioned in your opening remarks the opportunity presented by Open RAN for increasing vendor diversity in the radio access networks, reducing costs was mentioned, I believe, increasing maybe the speed of rollout. We also heard some comments about security and interoperability, where I think views largely were on the positive side, but if you listen to the discussion, there are cautionary statements being made as well. So I think the first question for the entire panel is, in your view, what are the main remaining challenges to solve in order to, if we want to fully unleash the potential of Open RAN here in Europe, for example, or elsewhere? But let's focus on Europe for this discussion, and how can we work to overcome those challenges? Who wants to start? Yih-Choung, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Happy to make a start for others to come in. I think what Tareq and Rakuten have done is absolutely brilliant and really inspiring, very encouraging in terms of how we can get a lot of the benefits he described through Open RAN. I think one of the things that strikes me in Europe, certainly in the UK, is that the challenge is that we have existing mobile networks with existing deployments and incumbent vendors. And I don't really see an opportunity anytime soon for someone to build a completely brand new network in the UK. That leads then to the question of integration with legacy networks and how quickly that can happen. And that's not a straightforward question, and that's partly where we're coming from in terms of our Sonic Labs testbed, an opportunity for vendors, big and small, to come and test how that might work, improve interoperability. But I think that is a challenging process which will take time, and there will be other testbeds to try and help that migration point. But I think that's the biggest challenge for us, that it's not a greenfield site, and we need to worry a little bit about backwards compatibility with existing legacy kit.
And on that point, I mean, are you working with mobile operators in the UK for that testbed activity?
Yes, absolutely. So we've been talking to the UK operators, as well as, of course, incumbent vendors and prospectively interested new vendors. And the Sonic Labs testbed is very much an early stage of technical readiness to try and provide a little bit of support to those who don't have the R&D skill to come in. The UK government has then bigger ambitions in terms of a UK telecoms lab, which would take that to a much bigger level and provide capacity and capability to try and help that process of integration in interoperability.
Very interesting. We'll keep track of that development. So, yeah, Lorelien.
I think so. Outside of this panel, I have heard sometimes views about Open RAN which are a little bit more pronounced. Like you have this. There seems to be like a distinction between believers of Open RAN and the non-believers, and I think we should try to stay away from such dogmatic discussions, because that's not worth it, honestly. It's all about innovation and embracing innovation, and indeed working towards supplier diversity, which can be good for resilience, but which obviously also brings challenges which have to be looked at. So I think it's important yes, like with any change, there are clearly upsides, but there are things that have to be looked at, and that shouldn't be neglected, of course. But I would like Europe to stay away as much as possible from these black and white discussions that we sometimes hear.
I like that comment. I think as regulators, we all often try to pride ourselves on being technology neutral. So the discussion and why we're talking about Open RAN here is not because we particularly want to support that technology. It's because we want, as you say, to have the ambition should not be implementing Open RAN. It should be having secure and reliable networks with sufficient diversity in supply chains. That is indeed a very good comment. Julie, I think you're on mute. The most common comment in these kind of conferences ever.
Sorry, and it still happens. So yeah, thanks a lot. I just would like to support and echo what was said about the need to have like a more sophisticated approach to this issue, and it's not about being for or against innovation. Absolutely not. So on our side, we really want to find the way to support innovation in the best possible way, and at the same time to articulate this with the other very important policy objectives, the timing targets, really important, the security objectives, and also the sustainability objectives. So what we feel is that we're only starting to scratch a bit the surface of these topics, and we're working with experts to look more in depth into this. And maybe three things. First, we are trying to identify a bit better the various scenarios for deployment. So what is it, short term, mid-term, long term? What kind of use cases will be the ones that Open RAN will be more suitable to support, etc. So we're looking at this because it has an impact then on the other policy decisions to try to understand what may or may not happen. Then from a security perspective, that, as I said earlier, we don't think we've fully analyzed everything yet. So that's also important in order to have the confidence to move forward with trusted approaches. And then of course, how can we foster an innovation-friendly and a good environment for EU players, including existing and new players. So that is also something that is central to our reflection. And to finish, of course, diversity, as you just said also, Dan, is important for resilience. It's however, not an objective in itself for us. It's the objective is resilience and security, and then we want to see what's the best path to achieve that, to maintain that. Well, at this stage, we're also looking at the impact of these new technologies and solutions in terms of diversity, short term, but also long term. So, there might be a lot of things that may happen as a result of these very exciting developments. And we would like to have some ideas about that to see also what are the conditions to realize these resilience objectives in the best way in a sort of future-proof manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Florian? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, two reactions. First, it's not a black and white world. Aside from this Open RAN ecosystem we're working on, we're already working on 6G as well. And there's a EU's project called 6G EXA-X project with key EU players, which is also funded to see which innovations we can bring in future mobile networks. The other thing is on Open RAN, does it solve network security and the resilience challenges? Well, Open RAN is not more secure per se. Rather, on the contrary, it creates new security challenges, which can and must be solved The potential variety of network elements originating from different vendors will need a considerable system integration effort, which is scaling in an exponential manner. The more products and solutions from different origins are being included in the network. So a requirement, which is instead of being a one-off action, needs to be understood as a continuous ongoing process, given regular software updates. And this will present a challenge, in particular to security, as security needs to be built into the overall system early on in the design phase, rather than being added on late in the process with solutions defined in the integration phase. And furthermore, if Open RAN is meant to diversify networks, it still requires the same security checks and certificates for all. In the future, more segmented network elements, as RAN and core components require today, and additional ones related to system integration. Therefore, the concepts of security and trust outlined, for instance, in the EU 5G toolbox apply equally to Open RAN.
Yeah, very sensible comments. I think I saw Jimmy raising a hand, and maybe before I just hand over the floor to you, Jimmy, if you could, whilst commenting, also maybe give us your take on what kind of development will we see in the short to medium term? How much Open RAN do you as a company foresee to have in your various networks in the years to come?
I think I'll answer that question, but I make my point first because it relates to Florian's and on the security angle. And I think one aspect of the security aspects to Open RAN, and which I think is important for regulators in particular, is that the security setup or the model for security in an Open RAN solution would be a bit different than the typical historic solution that we've had. And as many of you know, we've undergone an extensive review of the parties that want to provide 5G in Sweden, a security review. And I would say that the regulatory framework that was used in that context wouldn't have allowed for an Open RAN solution. I don't think so. At least it wasn't tested by any operator, so we can't know for certain. But I don't think Open RAN would have been allowed, and in particular by the security authorities. And therefore, if we want Open RAN to be one alternative for the future, then I think the security agencies need to, as they are in certain countries, be involved in the discussion and also educated on how networks are built, etc. So I think that's a role for the telecom regulator to have a discussion with the security authorities on that. And that was related to Florian's, but that is also part of an answer to your question, Don. I don't think it can be a solution at least not in the short to medium term for Telenor Sweden. But Telenor as a group is a different thing, and we are definitely exploring different ways of working with Open RAN as part of our broader setup, since we are so committed to vendor diversity. But for Sweden, I would say not in the short to medium term.
Okay, thank you. Is it Lorelien? Yep, please go ahead.
Yeah, indeed. Sorry, I would just, maybe this is a bit of a, like playing a little bit the devil's advocate, because we hear so many different views on this element of supplier diversity and security. And honestly, I think sometimes, yes, of course, when there are more suppliers and there's interoperability, the security discussion becomes different. That's a fact, and there are questions that need to be looked at. But I would like to nonetheless place a critical note with the statement that it becomes immediately more challenging. I mean, I've heard in the cloud world, we hear very often the point that it is important to have supplier diversity precisely for the resilience. So I think we should try to be consequent in that sense.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think it's not black and white, as we've heard, and many aspects come into the resilience and the security discussions that we are having. And I think you mentioned a few of them, and I'm sure that there will be developments. And I think also Jimmy's comment about the impact of other agencies than the telecom regulators is something that is going to become more pronounced as we move into digitized societies where the telecom services are really the basis for so many sensitive societal services. And as you said, this is it's something which is, I think we're in the beginning of this phase, and much more will come. Does anyone want to say anything more on Open RAN before we move on to our next topic? You seem to be ready to move on. And I'll remind the audience that you can still submit questions if you have any. Now, we thought we would talk a little bit indeed about the pace of change of legislation, not least in the area of security. This links, as we have heard, to investments, to foreseeability, how much risk is it reasonable to assume that the investment is supporting. So we see a lot, we have seen over the last years, many new proposals, regulations ongoing beyond the code, which in itself was a huge legislative program. There are many things coming on as we talk, and cybersecurity, of course, is very key among those. So all of that activity addresses relevant issues. It's useful to add all of these layers of new legislation, no doubt about that. But how is it impacting us? That's, I think, a little bit what we want to discuss here, and we want to hear the views of the panel on the pace and scale of regulatory activity, focusing maybe a little bit on that coming out of the European Commission, looking also at whether we are hitting the right targets, and whether there are means to work with regulation in any other way, which is putting the burden on the ecosystem different from what it is today, when I think we're all feeling that there are so many changes going on, and being an expert on everything that happens is going to become more and more challenging over time. So with that sort of question, maybe it's logical to ask Julie, as a representative of the European Commission, to say something about whether this pace is necessary, useful, and continuing. What is your view on the stage of new legislation here?
Thank you, Dan. Well, so first of all, of course, not surprised that regulation is not the favorite for industry in general, and we understand those concerns. And but I think it's really at the heart of how we're doing things. So in the code and the review of the telecoms framework is something that was precisely meant to clarify the scope and the conditions as much as possible, and ensure the predictability and the harmonization that you've been talking about. Then we've tried to complement that with some policies like what's in the connectivity toolbox. So lots of toolboxes, but there is one about how to facilitate the rollout of networks and simplify procedures, etc., reduce costs. So we're taking an approach to try to enable as much as possible rather than to put constraints. So that is one side, and then there's the security area where I heard several remarks, and well, there I think the effort around creating this 5G security toolbox was precisely to try to have a common understanding of the risks among member states, a common methodology to analyze those risks, and then a common set of measures that can be used. We are seeing that member states are committed to apply this methodology. And at the same time, we can't avoid that there will be variations in the modalities. First of all, because there are different ways of doing things on security, but also because there are different analysis of the risks and threats at national level, which necessarily have to be taken into account too. But I mean, still there is a lot of efforts that have been invested to try to make this as consistent, as convergent as possible, and we will try to continue to work towards that. And then this is a bit the same also objective we had with the proposal on NIS2, bringing telecoms into that framework has the objective of sort of putting things in a consistent framework together with the regulation on cybersecurity for other critical infrastructures, which are also all interrelated. And we do not think that this will lead to any major disruption or new rules for the providers necessarily. It's really very much just a change of umbrella at EU level and putting that into governance framework on cybersecurity, which should give the opportunity also to the supervisory authorities, which are in charge today, to become part of this community. And we think it's very important to create those bridges so that the telecom regulators and the cybersecurity authorities and everyone is part of the discussion at EU level on this. But this is very much something that will affect the EU cooperation, whereas at national level, we do not see that this will have a major disruptive impact on the current way of doing things. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to answer to this question.
Okay, thanks, Julie. And with that, I think I'll open up for comments from the remainder of the panel about the pace and scale of new rules coming your way. Yih-Choung.
Yes, I mean, for me, this is a question, I think, of trade-offs and timing. At least I would say those are things that we need to be very, very mindful of. You know, obviously Jimmy has the operator perspective, but what I would observe is that there are lots of pressures at the moment. So obviously on security, where in the UK we've been concerned about high-risk vendors, and we have quite a lot of Huawei equipment in our networks. And a big debate about how quickly some of that should be reduced and eventually removed. So, you know, a reduction to 35% after about 3 years, and then by 2027 for that not to be in our 5G networks. That obviously drives costs into for the operators. But then we've just been discussing with Open RAN, we have a long-term view of, you know, the security concerns aren't going to just be dealt with by prohibiting certain equipment, but that of course requires a different sort of investment, and that adds costs as well when we then look at those new technologies. And then of course we want to say at the same time, well, we want to have the rollout of 5G networks as quickly as possible. So please get on and spend money and do that too. And we've just had a spectrum auction in the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz. You know, arguably didn't result in as high payments as some people thought, but nevertheless, that's another cost. So I'm very mindful as a regulator that you have to have a good understanding of the commercial reality of how all these things are going to get squared. As you were saying, Dan, earlier, when it comes to the security issues, we work very, very closely with the National Cybersecurity Centre, so we understand what the level of threats are and that risk assessment. And somehow the government has to consider those things in the round when we think about some of those trade-offs and the timing of how realistic I think some of these things are. So that would be kind of my broad observation.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just for the audience, it would be interesting if you would say a few words on no longer being part of the European Union. I mean, how are you relating to to what comes out of the legislative processes in Brussels as of moving forward. Is that something you can address in a broad, sort of general way?
Yes, very generally. I mean, we implemented the NIS directive. That was whilst we were still within the European Union. We have updated guidance and revised some of that recently, and we spend quite a lot of time working with operators of essential services in that domain because it's really, really important. And actually, I think the security issues will increasingly be in that domain. I mean, I like to think that despite the fact that we have left the European Union, that we continue to have very good relationships with BEREC and with other regulators, you know, including yourself and other panel members. And for me, that is critically important, even if we are on a slightly different course now. It goes to some of the points about harmonization. I think political developments are interesting, where there's a certain degree of national focus. But as we've discussed, whether it's cyber security threats or whether it's global supply chains, I'm not sure those are, you know, very good respecters of national boundaries. And so, if anything, I would say the fact that the UK has left the European Union makes me want to work all the harder in terms of our international partnerships and our relationships. I think that becomes even more important because some of those fora are not ready made for us quite in the way that we have had for many, many years.
Thanks. That was a little bit of a side issue, but I thought it would be interesting for you to say that to the audience, and that sounds very sensible indeed. So back to the question on the amount of regulation coming your way, and what about you, industry representatives? How are you coping with engaging in these new areas? Jimmy, please.
Yes, first, let me start, since it's often assumed that industry players want us less regulation is good regulation, but I wouldn't say that. We think that good regulation is good for serious actors such as ourselves. So we are not hostile to regulation as such. We think that keeps bad actors away from the trade, which is good for everyone. However, the speed of change is a problem in itself. I think we have just in this country 4 or 5 different major regulatory changes within the supply chain kind of field for telecom operators. And when you try to build a network that, as I mentioned, should work for a decade or more, of course you need to do changes during that time. But when regulatory changes are put in that make you change your network in a way that then are prohibited, it creates problems. And I think the consistency between different regulations could be better. Actually, for example, national regulation compared to the EU toolbox, etc. And that's why I called for a bit more harmonization before, not total harmonization, because we of course understand that different nations must make their own judgment on what is best for them, but some harmonization and consistency over time is needed.
Okay, thank you. Florian, no? Lorelien?
Yeah, I can fully subscribe to what Jimmy said. Again, I think really what the Commission has done with the NIS proposal is to try and look at this holistically, and I think we really need to do that. All sectors are getting digitalized. So there needs to be a set of foundational requirements that are similar across all these sectors. And true, I hear that BEREC says the telecommunications sector is special because it's the foundation, but that also goes for other industries like cloud or energy, and every regulator will think that his or her sector is special. I'm closely involved in the DORA negotiations with the financial regulations and DG FISMA, and they think that the finance sector is also very special. So and if you end up doing this in a very fragmented way, sector by sector, you will have overlaps and inconsistencies. We have seen those already between NIS and ECC in the past, where we have seen some countries implementing both. And so really we think working first at the foundational layer, horizontally, and then look sector by sector which additional add-on elements are still required is really the best way forward. And of course, Jimmy, I understand your point that you say you cannot throw away the existing telecom regulation, and that needs to be accounted for in NIS or somewhere. The existing framework must be respected or changed in a due timing. But I do insist on the need. I think the Commission has really chosen the right way forward with the NIS 2 proposal. And to make a plea, I think we should even extend that to the financial services. But that's another discussion.
Thank you. It's good to hear that everyone is special. Florian, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, indeed. So I also support Jimmy's message when it comes to the need for more harmonization and regulatory consistency. I'll just give one example about the NIS 2 proposal. So we have the Connecting Europe Facility 2 emphasizing on the importance of having cross-border 5G and fiber networks and deploy digital services over these networks. So the question is directly about the NIS 2, if we include now public electronic communications networks and services, to which supervision will be, which competent authority will be the supervisory for these specific cross-border networks, and that's one of the questions that we have for now. Just to be pragmatic.
Okay. Did I see Jimmy asking the floor again? Yes, please.
Yes, and to add to that, the competence of the authorities. To us, I think we both understand each other, Lorelien, but for us, it's having the telecom regulator as our main regulator, and having the telecom regulation in the IIC brings us more clarity, we think, perhaps dependent also on the history of the regulation and that it has been built over quite a long time. And we can't really foresee the exact consequences of moving it. However, we do see a need for regulating other parts of the supply chain within, for example, the framework of NIS 2. So we have a coherent regulation, which is not putting all the regulatory burden on one part of the supply chain, but rather covering all different parts of it, or the most important.
Okay, so we've had
just answering that we are both in the telecoms framework and in the cloud computing. So I think we will be in scope, if that reassures you.
That's good.
I think that's also something which is not unique to this discussion about NIS 2. I think the way that digitization is affecting our societies is quite often now stretching boundaries, and we find many of the things that we are discussing now with the DMA and the DSA proposals also are a little bit new to us in the sense that they don't really fit with the traditional agency structure that we are used to, sort of putting things simply into, and that I think just calls for more collaboration and more cooperation moving forward, and this might be another area. But I wanted to get back to Julie on NIS and see if she has any updates for us on what is to be expected as we move forward here with NIS in terms of timing, if not in substance.
Thanks. Well, in terms of timing, I mean, I'm not the one sitting in those negotiations, but I hear that it's progressing well. So the council finished the first part of the work, reading through the whole proposal, and so ready also to go to the next phase. And so is the Parliament, so that they're also advancing. So I think we will see, important steps taken after the summer on this. Well, cannot predict when it will end, but it's going well, and I think we see a lot of support overall for the approach that has been proposed by the Commission. So we're confident that we can, overcome the different issues that have been raised, because there are also indeed some issues and some things to clarify a bit further. One of them is also indeed the articulation with sectoral frameworks. So this is something that we will work a bit more on. And but to come back again to the specific point of telecoms, and again, we really would like to try to reassure that we do not see the scenario that you fear materializing, in the sense that here we're talking about very high level requirements in the code versus also quite high level requirements in the NIS directive. And what has happened over the past years is that the national regulators have developed that into practical measures and guidelines. And we really see that those guidelines would fit equally, whatever, regardless of the umbrella instrument at EU level. Of course, technology evolves, security threat evolves, so things might need to be adjusted, but we're not talking about revolution here. And NIS2, of course, includes a number of a couple of new requirements, such as I said, the spotlight on supply chain security, but that goes also into the direction that you mentioned, that you would like to see the whole environment considered. So that is a bit of a new dimension. But overall, for the rest, the basic security requirements that are set out in this proposal are fairly in line with what was in the code. And there is also no prescription as to who should regulate or not at national level. So that there's no reason to suggest that something should change as a result. So it's something that the NIS2 doesn't address, and it's for member states to continue to determine how this is being done. But we see benefits. We see that it can bring all the actors together under this common umbrella, that instead of having to find complicated ways of making sure everyone is around the table, because we have different fora, etc., for discussion, we would clearly have one place, the NIS Cooperation Group, where the discussions can take place, which would really facilitate the consistency that you're calling for. And also at other levels of operational cooperation, CSIRTs, etc. We have all this governance framework. It is in the NIS community and context. So we would just encourage you to take another look at what is proposed, and consider also those positive improvements.
Thank you, Julie. Jimmy?
Yes, no, I understand that perspective, but I think also from our perspective, we need to think of the regulation, the NIS2 regulation, or the NIS regulation, but the NIS2 in this context, in relation to not only the ECC, but also to different national security regulations. And that makes the situation even more complex for us. I'm not convinced that it would create less complexity for us, even if it might do that on other parts. And I also do not agree that it's basically the same requirements, at least as we read it. There are in the proposal, for example, new reporting obligations that would be quite complicated for us to live up to. We think, for example, that reporting should prioritize significant actual incident and not potential ones, such as reporting on threats, because that's very hard to define, basically. So we think that there are both issues that we have with the substance of the proposal, but also with the organizational setup and the regulatory framework as such, where we prefer the existing one.
Okay, so this turned a little bit into a discussion about the NIS 2 proposal in particular. I don't know if anyone in the panel has further questions or comments on that proposal, or more generally the topic of the amount of the new regulation that we're working on. Yeah, Lorelien.
Maybe just one additional thought. It has been mentioned several times by Jimmy, also by Florian, that harmonization across borders is also important. And I think this is important, of course, to avoid the red tape and administrative burden, but this is also truly important in order to stimulate the digital single market. And I think that is maybe not sufficiently taken into account sometimes in practice, how important it is to have a basic level of security requirements across Europe that is sufficiently harmonized in order to allow innovative services to take up.
Okay, perfect. I don't see any raised hands, so I think we can, with some 20 minutes left on. Oh, Florian, please.
Yeah, I would like also to emphasize on international cooperation, since we're looking at the security aspect. Member states and also EU authorities should really follow, to the greatest extent possible, international and European standards, as well as voluntary industry initiatives in regard to network security and risk management. And sorry, the one I want to point out is for example, the GSMA NISAS, which stands for Network Equipment Security Assurance Scheme. And the overall objective is to provide an industry-wide security assurance framework and security baseline to facilitate improvements in security levels across the whole mobile industry. And I see benefits, major benefits for different stakeholders. Look, for national authorities, regulators, and the European Commission, I see that as a security assurance scheme readily available for their use. An increased effective security while not negatively impacting the industry, but also it helps to avoid fragmentation of security requirements across the global market. There are also many benefits, not only for mobile network operators, but also for equipment vendors. So NISAS is designed to be recognized and adopted by regulatory authorities, and the scheme provides the methodology, the security requirements, and security test cases necessary to support a robust security framework.
Well, that was almost perfect on cue, because I was going to say that I suggest that we move for the last part of the panel into a little bit of a discussion on what we can do in order to better achieve international cooperation in practice, and focusing maybe a little bit on this area of security and resilience that is sometimes a little bit challenging. As we have heard, there are perhaps more national initiatives there than in other areas. So on areas such like as technical harmonization, normally I think it's easier to collaborate, and I think the practice is there for a long time. But when it comes to threat analysis and things like this, which may be different in different countries, what is your view? I mean, how can we do this better? And I think it's a good panel to discuss this, because we have three representatives of really global companies here, and we have a regulator who is not an EU regulator, and we have a regulator who is part of the European Commission. So I think we're in good company for a discussion. Can we take the international cooperation / harmonization further in this area, and how can we achieve that in practice? Does anyone feel prepared to give an initial thought? I think, Florian, you may already have given yours, I think. But that is, maybe if you just confirm, I think that's more on the technical side, if I understand you well.
Yes, indeed, it's more on the technical factors. Absolutely. maybe I can add one point is that maybe the NIS2 could actually formally task ENISA with developing technical guidelines on security measures to be mapped against relevant standards and certification. That would be as a means to demonstrate compliance for both essential and important entities. And I think that would be an important task, which we would support.
And maybe if I ask the industry representatives here a little bit, I mean, how much is this discussed in your companies that you have different developments? I mean, is this seen as a major issue, or is it something that you're coping well with, or in between? Where are we? Lorelien.
Yes, for us, no surprise, this is obviously an important topic, and I think as Microsoft, we have on several occasions pleaded publicly for more international cooperation in this area. We also need to be realistic, of course. I mean, we can hardly expect that. I mean, this is something that doesn't happen overnight. Of course, it would be better if all the standards were the same across all the world for us, but that's not realistic, and that wouldn't also fit with national sovereignty. But at least within Europe, and especially for digital services which are cross-border, we think it's really, really important to work towards stronger harmonization, and that will also allow Europe to have a stronger voice in the international discussions, we believe. And yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you. I think I saw Julie. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Maybe I just react right now on that point and point by Florian about certification and standardization. So this is actually happening. So we have the Cybersecurity Act, which allows us to develop certification schemes for the EU. So EU-wide certification schemes. And earlier this year, we've tasked ENISA to start preparing a certification scheme for 5G networks. And in our discussions, the discussions that we had with member states, we clearly came to the conclusion that a good approach will be to take into account what's been already developed by industry. So it's really something where we want to partner with industry in moving forward with this scheme. And of course, we want to build on international standards in all the work that we do on certification as much as possible. It's in our interest. We know that it's in industry's interest that we take this global perspective. But of course, we also will need to take into account the perspective of the regulators and then the needs from a public interest perspective. So this is only just starting now, but it's a very important process. At the same time, we need to be clear about what certification can and cannot do. So, according to the toolbox, clearly there's a role for several different measures that should be applied jointly, and certification is there, and we convinced that it can help support, help address a certain technical risk up to a certain level. So we're working towards that, to have this tool as well as the others available. And we think it's the best way to do this jointly, instead of having every member state, develop its own certification approach. So for that, we are already looking at something fully harmonized down the line. And at least that's our goal. But again, I mean, doesn't take away the need to address other types of risks that were identified in the coordinated risk assessment that we did with member states. But I think that is that is clear at this point. So yeah, we will look forward to continue the dialogue with you also while we progress in this process.
Thank you, Julie. Maybe a question more for you, Julie. Can you say anything about what the Commission is doing in terms of discussing these kind of issues with partners outside the Union?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, 5G security, as we know, it's a central key topic for also our partners, our main partners. So I think it has become sort of almost a standard agenda point, you know, in every discussion that we have around digital, we are discussing also security issues. We're discussing 5G and 5G supply chain developments. So that there's clearly there an interest from our side, but also from the side of our partners to talk together and see you know, how best to reach common goals, common objectives. But of course, there's also a different level of maturity in terms of positions. So now we have the 5G toolbox, and we can engage on that with third countries, whether it is to cooperate or to also share our experience and knowledge in this area. We're doing a lot on this front. But then moving back to the topic that we discussed earlier about Open RAN, about generally evolutions in network approaches, there I think we feel like we need to develop our, you know, European way maybe before we can move forward like really constructively. So this is something, as I said, we're working with experts in all sorts of fields to determine what's in the best European interests, and of course, while at the same time being very mindful and interested in what others are doing. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Anyone else on the panel? Yeah, please, Yih-Choung.
Thanks, Dan. Perhaps a less technical answer to international cooperation, but and obviously, as you know, I believe that's critically important for us. But I thought to practical examples, maybe I'll give you three. One, when it comes to Open RAN and diversification, I think you know, we really value the Five Eyes partnership that we have with other countries on security matters. So, for example, I was speaking with the FCC chairwoman just a couple of weeks ago about Open RAN, and our teams are working very closely together. I know she's about to join us shortly. Secondly, on security risks, I'm sure people will have seen the flu bot spyware issue we've had recently, text messages sent to Android phones. And so we've been working very closely with Google in how we think about combating that. And then finally, a little bit of a different example, I guess, but as many of you will know, we are preparing to take on new duties beyond the telecom space into online safety. And that, of course, is a really challenging endeavor and very much a global one. So I was speaking with the Microsoft CEO in the UK just a couple of weeks ago, for example, about the Digital Crimes Unit, which I think is an amazing resource that Microsoft has with its Windows footprint across the world to be able to detect issue scams, fraud that's happening earlier. And so I think these partnerships are absolutely critical in terms of how we pool our resources together to essentially make a lot of these online challenges more feasible as we look to make the internet a safer place.
Thank you. So I think we are slowly going towards the end of this panel. I think it's been a very it's provided a lot of insights for me. I don't know, does anyone want to have a last go at any of the topics we've been discussing? Jimmy, please.
Yes, just a short comment on the last discussion we had. That, of course, we absolutely support international standards and certifications, and also working together on the European level. But I think what was mentioned about the Five Eyes cooperation, for example, we must also be prepared that if countries are not ready to give authority to the European Union in certain areas, then we should open up for more bilateral cooperations as well. That would make it easier for us to build different cybersecurity threats, or build technical solutions to counter cybersecurity threats.
Perfect, thank you. Just scanning the panel here. I think I don't see anyone really seeking the floor. So I think I'll give you a digital big hand of applause for your contributions to the panel. Thank you very much. I think we've heard quite a lot of common ground. I think on Open RAN there's a lot of interest. It holds certainly potential. It may not be a silver bullet, and we need to continue to work with it and see how it fits with other policies, with installed bases, and many things like this. We have also had, I think, a good discussion on the amount and need for more regulation, more cross-cutting regulation, and the impact that digitization has on the type of regulation we see. We had a very specific deep dive into NIS2, and it will be interesting to see how that continues to play out in the debate amongst legislators in Brussels. Of course, we all follow that closely. And now, finally, I think we all share the common ground that more international cooperation, both inside and outside of the EU, will be needed. And I should also just repeat that I very much look forward to more reports on the sandbox activity that the UK is setting up for testing some of these new open architecture applications. So again, my great thanks to the panel, and I believe I am to hand over to the BEREC chair, Michelle van Bellingen, for the next point on the program. Thank you very much.